Thank you, AJ, for the introduction. I feel very humble about being given this award, and as Gary Waghorn said, it would be better to be a living legend than a dead legend. I started my work at Ruakura at number 3 Dairy, and I was there for a couple of years, and I moved to number 2 Dairy, and my mentor there was Des Clayton. And following on from that, I decided I really started there to try and earn enough money, so I'm interested in farming and going farming. But I really enjoyed the work, so I took the opportunity and I went to Lincoln University, did a diploma in field technology, and that inspired me to continue on. And so I owe a lot to the mentors I've worked with, but also to my wife in supporting me through those years. Because when I was at Lincoln, we had a 2.5-year-old child. We lived out in the country, about 15 kilometres from the university, so not an easy life in the mid-1970s. So this is number 2 Dairy. As you can see in the background are the buildings for the university, and this was probably in the 1980s. Most of the work at number 2 Dairy was in farmlet studies, so we ran farmlets of 5 up to 8, maybe 10 farmlets in one trial, and at one time we had a 10 farmlet study plus a 4 farmlet study running at the same time. So quite hard to manage in terms of moving cows around. So when you've got 14 farmlets, you've got 14 groups of milking cows going into the dairy, each milking. You've got 14 groups of dry cows possibly, and other groups around the farm. So this is number 2 Dairy. So this is the area really behind us about 10 to 15 years ago, and the entrance, line just, it's not working, but the middle road there going up through it is was the boundary for number 2 and number 5 dairies. This is what it looks like now. So those areas where I did the research was mainly now into buildings and also container ports and roads. The person who really had the biggest influence on my life was Arnold Bryant. And he was a big guy, gruff personality, and a really good mentor, a good friend. But the type of friend who you didn't really want at times, because when I was about to give my first presentation to the Ruakura Farmers Conference, I remember him saying to me, "This is going to test the straining ability of your underpants." Not very helpful, particularly when at high school, when we had speeches to give, I never turned up. I was always sick. But anyway, the first series of trials he ran was looking at pasture management during the winter and autumn, and we had a series of rotation lengths ranging from about 40 days up to 120 days. And you can see on that graph, as we increased in average rotation length, the amount of feed on the farm in mid-August was much higher. The problem was that we were able to generate that extra feed, but we didn't make advantage of it. And one of the things was that farmers were being told about different rotation lengths and how you should manage it. But Arnold set it up so the next trial was, again, we had those slow rotations, and I'm just going to highlight the 3 that I've got yellow there, 128 days during the winter and 32 days after calving. There's a basic rotation length. The other 2 groups are 32 to 64, so quite fast rotations during the autumn-winter period, and in the spring period after calving, quite slow or very fast. So the very fast one was trying to fully feed the cows as much as you could feed them, maximise production. This graph shows the amount of available feed, and that group that were on a 128-day rotation, they had about 1,400 kilograms of dry matter available feed, so that's about 3,200 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. And so they had a lot of feed, but after calving, that feed was eaten, and then you can just see it rising again slowly during the spring. The group that were on a faster rotation and also had a very slow rotation, which is the diamond group line there, dotted line, You can see how the feed on the farm dropped down very quickly, but then just tracked along behind the other group. The group that were on a very fast rotation, ran out of feed, and they had an average cover in August of about 200 kilograms above grazing height. So about 1,600 kilograms of dry matter per hectare average farm cover. So they were under pressure for most of the spring. The summary of that was that the slower the rotation during the winter, the greater the feed available at calving. And from these trials came the autumn and spring rotation planners, which farmers use now. So we ran also about that time was the information about feeding calves. You had to maximise growth on calves to maximise production. There was questions about the advisability of doing this. So a trial was run, Arnold set it up, and John Penno was involved as well. And the calves were taken from dairy farms at 4 days of age and reared at 2 different growth rates, either pre-puberty or after puberty. The interesting thing was that the level of feeding pre or post-puberty only had an effect in the first lactation. The second and subsequent lactations, there was no effect. So what happened is that the poorer fed animals, they ate more during their first lactation, they produced less, but they gained a lot of body weight and condition score. In the early 1990s, there was a concern about not growing enough feed on the farm, and a lot of farmers were bringing maize silage in to feed the cows. So a trial was set up trying to maximise production from the farm and not too interested in the cost, but just can you do it? And trying to achieve a target of 1.75 tonne or 1,750 kilograms of milk solids per hectare. There were 2 stocking rates, 3.4 and 4.4 cows per hectare. And so at the higher stocking rates, supplements were added in, either maize silage, maize grain, or a balanced ration. And again, there was 8 farmlets, and so along the top there we've got the LSR, which is a low stocking rate, HSR, high stocking rate, and either 0, 200 or 400 kilograms of nitrogen. And really it's the yellow ones that I'm interested in, but if we look at the production, it ranged from 390 for the low stocking rate up to back down to about 267 for the high stocking rate, low nitrogen. The important thing about that high nitrogen, low stocking rate is that that's good to grow that extra grass, but you've got to have systems in place to ensure that you capture that feed and turn it into milk solids. The interesting thing was the EFS, or operating profit. The low stocking rate had the highest operating profit, and the system where balanced ration, the ideal, in inverted commas, food for the cows was fed to the animals, was really uneconomic. About that time, John Penno started at work in Dexel, DairyNZ those days, and he was starting to do his PhD. And the trial he set up to do that was called whole farm efficiency, and there was a range of stocking rates, 2.2 through to 4.3 cows per hectare. This trial was also set up to establish, to get information for developing a whole farm model, so that trials could be run on the computer before they were taken out into the paddock. So this graph shows the production for milk solids per cow and milk solids per hectare. The bottom line is the milk solids per cow, and you can see how as we increased stocking rate, milk solids per hectare per cow dropped. The top line being the milk solids per hectare, and as we increased stocking rate, milk solids per hectare went up from about 950 or 900 up to about 1,200 or 1,250. See, there's quite a strong relationship there. How did that affect profitability? So the economics of it was that the optimum stocking rate was somewhere around 3 cows per hectare. And that was also confirmed in earlier trials that have been run at number 2 dairy where Jerseys and Friesians have been compared. About 3 cows per hectare was the optimum for the Holstein Friesians. One of the things that came out of this trial was nitrate leaching, and Mike Sprosen from Ag Research wrote a paper which he presented to a fertiliser conference and just showing the effects of these stocking rates and the amount of nitrate leaching. And I wanted it published further, and I didn't get much traction, so I decided to do it myself, and I involved John Roach with me. Because the interesting thing was that as we increased stocking rate, nitrate leaching decreased. And this goes against all conventional thinking. You have more cows on the farm, you're going to have increased nitrate leaching. But it's not the number of cows, but it's how you manage those cows that's important. Under just a pastoral system like this, where you're just relying on pasture, at a high stocking rates, the cows are dried off early. The average rotation length average days in milk might be 225, 230 days. And so you dry them off early to get the cows back in condition score 5 for calving and having enough feed on the farm at calving. At the other end of the scale, the low stocking rates, you milk the cows for longer. So they get milked through the autumn-winter period when it's wet at the critical leaching period. So there's quite a strong relationship there. So really, as I said, it's not how you manage, not the stocking rate per se, but how the cows are managed as to what's critical. And earlier, I discussed about homes, about sheds for cows. That is one way you will be able to reduce leaching because you can control the amount going back onto the pasture. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of interest about the Holstein Friesians that were in New Zealand. Did they suit our environment? So a trial was set up looking at the Holstein Friesians we had here and comparing them with the 1970s genetics. So LIC went into the semen banks, pulled out semen from the 1970s, and it was inseminated into cows of similar genetic ability. And the 1990s New Zealand genetics, and also North American 1990s genetics. So this is a graph of the body condition score of the cows. And the top line is the 1970s cows. You can see they dropped down a little bit of condition score as we went through the seasons. And this data is of the same cows. So the cows at the end of the trial there, or the end of the graph, sorry, are the same cows as the front of the graph. So it excludes the ones that dropped out of the system. So we're looking at the continuation effect. The 1970s cows maintained quite good body condition score. The North American cows really struggled, particularly as they got into their third lactation, dropping down to a body condition score of a bit over 3. And that creates a real problem for them under a New Zealand pastoral system that we need to either dry them off earlier or push a lot more feed into them when they are dry and late lactation to get them back to a body condition score 5. This just shows the effects on reproduction. The New Zealand 1970s animals, they had reached puberty at about 329 days of age. North American animals about 44 days later. Exactly the same with puberty, 230 kilograms of live weight, 274. The interesting thing is that the New Zealand 90s genetics were in the middle, so we're already moving towards the more North American type cattle. Production per cow, 380 for the New Zealand 1970s genetics and 468 for the New Zealand 90s. And the North American animals, again, struggled, as I said, with body condition score, but they also struggled in having lower reproductive ability. So about 54% got in calf in the first 6 weeks of inseminating, and overall 87%, so 13% failed to get in calf. And that had an effect upon the calving date. So after 3 years, the mean calving date for those farmlets were between 7 and 10 days later than the other 2 farmlets. Then in the mid-2000s, I was luckily, or some people might say unluckily, involved with Gary Waghorn and running a trial called residual feed intake. Gary was the leader and I was responsible for managing it and trying to manage Gary. The first part was easy, the second part was not. So the selection process is that we purchase calves at 4 days of age. They were reared on commercial farms, and then they were taken to Taranaki, to the Westpac Taranaki Agricultural Research Station, and they were put through feed facilities there feeding lucerne cubes. And we use lucerne cubes because it's a forage, it's consistent feed, and initially we had to import it from Canada, but later we got it from Australia. And also a similar trial was run in Australia at the same time. So these are the bins their calves had their feed in, the cubes, and also one of them eating the cubes. The pens, they were. This just shows a range of growth rates from the animals. So really it's a deviation from what you would expect when you take the animal's weight and how much it's eating. You can see that there's quite a bell-shaped curve there, ranging from, on the right, the least efficient to the most efficient. And what the trial demonstrated is that the 10% most efficient calves required 22% less feed than the 10% that were least efficient. So quite a big difference. But importantly, as they went through to cows, the animals that were most efficient as calves were still the most efficient as lactating animals, though we couldn't pick up the difference in intake as much, so it's only about a 3-4% feed difference. But there's a lot happening when a cow is lactating, and you're only measuring it for a short period. With calves, when you're measuring it, all you're measuring is growth rate. This is Gary's big contribution to the project. He swears that these two people ate the same amount of food, and the guy is just much more efficient than the lady is. In the 1980s, 1990s, I became involved in body condition scoring, and so I started doing it on farms, doing some demonstrations. But what I was doing was basically being developed years before that, but just trying to put it in a more better context so the farmers could understand it. I used to have little pamphlets I'd give out, but farmers wanted a bit more. So John Roach and I got together and produced a booklet in about 2004, which went to all dairy farmers. The problem was that I manipulated the photos of the cows to change their body condition score by shading or stretching them or bringing them together, and farmers picked up on that. So a later booklet was produced where a farmer, very helpful farmer, bought some cows and he had them photographed every couple of weeks, so we could add photos of them changing in body condition score, and we could use real cows. In late 1990s, John Penno and I produced a paper to the NZSAP conference, and it was on management decision rules. And really it was from around the learnings that I'd got from these trials, and also added into it from other trials like mastitis work, reproduction. And they're put together so to assist farmers and also to ensure that we managed our trials in the same way from year to year. But the important thing was that the decision rules that we were advocating ensure that feed supply or problems in 1 year do not go from 1 year to the next. So you dry the cows off early enough to have them in body condition score 5 at calving, and you have enough feed on the farm at calving. All it's saying is that farmers need to be proactive and not reactive. At the same time, I produced a little booklet that went to all dairy farmers called Profitable Dairying, and that was really a summary of what I thought was the important parts of the research from 1940s through to 1990s, and the influence that it would have on farmers and how farmers could use that information on their farms. At that time, Arnold Bryant had asked me to write a brief summary of all the work that was being done in a bit of a science form. And I put it into the back of this booklet, and a guy, Peter Brumby, who used to work at Ruakura in the 1950s and 1960s and then worked for the World Bank, he sent me an email and said, you should put it into a science paper. And I thought, no, too hard. So I just put it aside, but over the years I would sit down and just add a little bit more to it. And as I got closer to retirement, I thought, yes, I should do it. So I enlisted the help of John Roach, and we put this paper together. John promised me that he would help me so we could get it finished by the Christmas after I retired. It was 5 Christmases later. Don't rely on Roach to help you. But anyway, so what I've been talking about, most of it is in here. I've just given a very brief summary today. With the farmlets, they were really good for having discussion groups, field days and things like that, because farmers could see what was happening on the farm and they could discuss what was happening, and also the scientists learned a lot more about what farmers thought. So here we've got Arnold Bryant talking on the Frisian Jersey trial, which was run in the 1990s, and at the back there is a university, which is just the buildings out the back here. They were really important in getting information across to farmers, and they used to draw big crowds. In the 1960s, there was up to 8,000 people went to the field days and open days. They have a big impact on farmers and play an important role in communicating the results. The Irish have copied the model New Zealand had of farmlet studies and open days, but I think the Irish are doing it much better than with the open days. We haven't continued that as well. And I fear that a lot of New Zealand farmers have lost the way and are using supplements rather than pasture. So they're not relying on the low-cost dairying systems that McMeekin and Bryant advocated at their cost. Last slide. So I found this in the 1968 proceedings, Ruakura Farmers proceedings. So I think the Ruakura Farmers conferences, field days were explosive, had a big effect. So this shows at that field day at Ruakura, they were demonstrating making drains. So you put an explosive in and blow it out. I don't think under the health and safety situation we've got now, you'd be able to do that. But it was very informative. And farmers enjoyed that. They had enjoyed being involved in things like that. And had field days the ideal way to do that. So once again, I'd like to thank the association for honouring me this way. As I said, I believe I was mentored by a lot of people. They assisted me, and I believe that I was probably a very good technician, not so much a good scientist. But what I did is I completed a lot of work that people hadn't finished. They either retired or moved on to greater things. And other people who I haven't put there who are great mentors for me were Dave Clark, Errol Tom, and John Roach. Thank you.